Hey guys, Tentacle Diff here. It's going to be a little bit of a different video than what we've put out recently. We've been mostly covering our climb. That's going pretty well. I think we're 24-4. We're in diamond games right now for a little bit of an update on that. However, I wanted to make more videos talking about Vel'koz, the champion itself, my thoughts on the game, and things like that. So we already did the first video yesterday about how I feel about the climb so far, how it feels climbing on Vel'koz support specifically. That's one thing about this video too, is there's going to be a slight Vel'koz support bias, which I'll kind of talk about at the end of the video, but I have played mid Vel'koz and APC Vel'koz as well, and I'll probably be doing climbs on those eventually in the future. That being said, we will get back to the climbing content shortly. I'll be posting more videos. I know there was a bit of a hiatus. The climb has not stopped. We've been doing it in the background. But yeah, I wanted to talk about some of these things. And we did the first video, and I wanted to talk about this ability haste topic because it's been something that's been kind of like topical recently. Azzapp, I think about like 15 days ago or something like that, he released a video. If you don't know who Azzapp is, he's the Vel'koz Challenger one trick from EU. I don't want to call him, sorry, not one trick, but he's most known for playing Vel'koz. He can play other things, right? Great player, super cool dude. Definitely check out his stream if you haven't. I figure most of you guys probably know who Azzapp is, though. And he made a video about 15 days ago detailing ability haste and how strong he thinks it is. And in fact, in his video, some of this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, I think, but he's basically saying, like, ability haste, like, carried me to rank 1. I abused this to rank 1. And so he thinks it's really strong. And then about 6 days ago or something like that, this Ben T Beyond Repair guy, who I believe is a Challenger support player, posted a video kind of refuting this idea that ability haste is a really great stat. And the first portion of his initial video was on Vel'koz, and then he talks about other champions as well in the later portion of the video. Then Azzapp made a reply to his video, and he just recently today made a reply back to that Azzapp video. So there's been kind of a chain. There's been a lot of debate about ability haste, specifically on Vel'koz, but also just generally. And I wanted to give my thoughts as a new player. I wanted to throw my hat into the ring now. You might be wondering, like, well, why would you even give your opinion as a new player? Because, you're new, right? What do you know? And, I totally understand that opinion. But I will say that kind of the stat crunching is a little bit of my forte because my background is partly in MMOs at least, right? I played a ton of MMOs, ton of World of Warcraft. We're very used to dealing with stats. I also play a ton of ARPGs, so we're really used to dealing with stats in ARPGs as well. So, stats are sort of my pet product in these games a lot of times. I'm always thinking about what stats are better for my characters, and not just from a mathematics perspective, but also from a practical, pragmatic perspective, like how am I actually implementing this stuff in the game? And that's something that Ben talks about in his videos as well. He mentions it as, there's one side where there's the mathematics and there's the other side where there's kind of like the intuition and the pragmatic aspect. And you have to marry them when doing these analyses, and I really agree with that. So I think he makes a great point there. And I wanted to talk about kind of both videos, but I'm going to be specifically focusing on Azapp's videos in particular because Ben does a fantastic job of kind of delving into the math side. And it's not that I don't want to delve into the math. In my original World of Warcraft channel, I have a bunch of videos where I go into math on stuff. But in this particular case, Ben has actually done a fantastic job of doing all the math out, right? So it would be redundant for me to just go back and do everything that he did. There's not really a point. He has all spreadsheets created and stuff like that. So I recommend that you guys watch Ben's video if you want a full understanding from his perspective, which largely comes from like the mathematical side. And I'm just going to do a brief summary at the start of this video of what he talks about to kind of give, him his flowers here. And then what I really want to do is talk about kind of like the intuition and feel side, which is what Azzapp is arguing from. And obviously this makes sense as, he has a ton of experience playing the champion. He's a Challenger. Vel'koz has been for a long time. So we'll jump right into just talking quickly about what Ben does, and then we'll go into the heart of the video. So what Ben's videos are mostly about, I would say, are like 3 different things related to Vel'koz at least. So the first is he talks about how, like, as your champion puts levels into an ability, so Q, for example, the value of ability haste ability haste kind of goes up typically. Okay, and the reason for that is because a higher percentage of your ability's damage is in the base damage, the more points you put in the ability, and you tend to get the ability levels way faster than you do AP. So you're going to be gaining a lot more damage from the actual base damage of an ability than actual AP you add until very, very late in the game, maybe when you have all your AP items and you have an AP scaler like Rabadon's, right? Then you'll start to see maybe more AP be added from the actual ability power side. But early on, you get way more. You get way more from the actual base damage of the abilities, which means that when the abilities are not at max level, you actually get more damage from ability power, right? Because you get the coefficient that the abilities are scaling the ability power through. That's the same at every level for most champions. So, for example, Vel'koz has a 90% AP ratio on his Q, and that doesn't change whether it's level 1 or level 5. So until the Vel'koz Q hits level 5, you're gaining more value on AP than you otherwise would, right? Like if the Q is at a very low level, and this is going to happen with all the abilities. Now on Q, it's kind of a bad example because that's the ability you max first, right? So you end up hitting that threshold where you get your full base damage earlier than you would in other abilities. But it's just something to keep in mind. The interesting thing about this calculation, though, is that even though once you're kind of like late game and established, or not necessarily late game, more like mid game, and you have a lot of your points in these abilities, he's finding that you still benefit more from AP in a lot of these cases than ability haste, right? Just in terms of like raw damage value. So it actually takes quite a few levels for you to actually get to a point where ability haste is starting to surpass ability power in terms of how powerful it is, just in like a raw DPS sense on Vel'koz. So that's kind of like the first thing he looks at in his videos. The second thing is that the passive that you have on Vel'koz is true damage. So even though it's a 60% ability power ratio, there's actually more value to that than you'd think at first, right? Because all these other things are going through the resistances, which in many cases can be quite substantial, especially if you don't have any pen. Vel'koz tends to not like to build a ton of pen, that's for sure. So, you're getting a lot of value typically on this true damage, and he makes note of that in his videos. And then the final thing is the ratio of abilities you're using. So, on Vel'koz, your Q has like a 90% AP ratio, but your E and your W have lesser AP ratios, and your alt has a good AP ratio if you hit all of it, but you're rarely hitting all of it. So one thing you can kind of take away from this as well, the vast majority of my abilities don't have very high AP ratios, so why would I build AP? The problem with this line of thinking is that the ratio of abilities you throw out really matters. So you tend to use a lot more Qs, obviously, than you use E's or W's or R's, right? And this is something you have to kind of account for in the analysis. So Ben's videos are great. Like I watched the first one all the way through. The second one I haven't touched. Well, I watched a little bit of it, but I haven't gotten all the way through yet. The reason why I didn't bother to watch the second Ben video to make this video is because, again, this video is going to be focused on more of Azzapp's intuition and field claims, and I'm just letting Ben handle the math side of things. So that being said, we'll just hop into the main points here, and I've tried to make a kind of a messy notepad document, but we'll give it a go and see how this goes. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was protracted fights. So I almost called him Vel'koz. Azzapp mentions this quite a lot in his videos, that a lot of fights are protracted, and ability haste really excels in protracted fights, right? You get more abilities, things feel really great. I would contest this claim, actually, and I think this is something you have to be very, very careful of when you start doing analysis, is that you have to be careful of what feels good to you, because feelings are sometimes based in... You tend to remember the highlights, we'll put it like that, right? So I'll give you a perfect example. Some of the best games I remember on Vel'koz are my highest damage games where I'm playing into teams where it's basically like full tank, or it's like full tank. They don't have a lot of actual dive though. Also, just very stationary mage and mid, something like a Brand or a Vel'koz. Very standard 80 carry, something like a Caitlyn doesn't have a ton of mobility. And the idea is, I'm just kind of sitting there in the back. I outrange most of these champions. I can touch them. They can't really touch me. I'm doing all the damage to them from a distance, not really under a lot of threat at all, not really pressured to hit a certain ability, right? Which means that it's actually easier for me to hit the abilities because now I can position myself in a more aggressive way where I am able to make sure the ability lands, right? And I'm basically getting all my damage off. I'm having a blast back there. I'm chaining abilities. I'm chaining ults. Ability haste feels great in these games, and I'm basically just stomping. I look at the end of the game. I do some of the most damage I've ever done, and I'm like, wow, that build was amazing. That felt so good. Like I want to do that every game. I've cracked the code. And this is something that's not just in video games people experience, right? I've played a lot of real sports as well, IRL, and you have this feeling in real sports too. Like I think a great example could be like if you've ever played football, if you played like quarterback position or something like that, and you figured out this particular style of defense that a team likes to use a lot. And it just feels like you've got the keys to the castle, you've won the game, and you're just going to be able to have your way with anybody, right? It's the same thing in basketball, right? If you're running a particular strategy in basketball. And this feels great up until things change and you have to adjust and you have to adapt. And in this case, though, I think it's even a little bit worse because realistically, the reason why some of these games feel so good is not just because you figured out how to play them, but because the games themselves kind of suit the style that your champion is built for, right? If they have a lot of non-threatening champions, things that can't dive you, things that move slowly, that's the perfect environment for Vel'koz to basically farm a bunch of damage, a bunch of kills, and win the game, right? So of course, the ability haste build is going to feel great in that setting. And what I would say is that really any build is going to feel great in that setting. And that's part of the problem, right? Is that I don't really care about what build you're using in these types of games where there's a lot of protracted fights, because you're probably going to win those games anyway. That's what you're built for. You're built for kiting. You're built for whittling down, for poking. And in games where you're able to utilize all these things to your advantage, you are going to naturally have such a strong advantage in these games that you should be winning them almost regardless of what you build, unless you do something really troll, like maybe you'll like full flat pen into a super tanky team or something like that. And I think in the future, I'm going to try to do a couple more climbs on this channel where I do one climb where we're very selective in our dodging, and I try and create a bunch of these environments where we're playing against these immobile champions, these tank champions, and we're able to just do a bunch of damage farming in these games, versus another account where I play every match that I log into no matter what, and we don't dodge. And I'll show you guys the difference that makes in the actual win rate, right? Because you're going to win way more games playing in the former than the latter. So I think that's a really important thing. And when we're talking about what is good on a champion, I think what we really have to kind of get down to is what about in the games that we're losing or we're behind? That's where this analysis is most important, right? So I don't really care how good something feels when we're winning. And in fact, how something good feels when we're winning, when we're crushing in a situation, that can bias us for games in the future, right? So I want to know what's actually good in games that are hard, in games where we're losing, in games where we have to hit our shots and we have to do maximum damage for every shot that we hit, because it's actually difficult to hit some of these very mobile champions, right? And when you do hit them, you want them to know it. You want them to hurt, because if it's very hard to hit them to begin with, and you hit them and you do a pittance of damage because you don't have any procs on your items or things like that, then it's going to be really difficult for you to contribute in these hard games where you have to hit a LeBlanc, you have to hit a Lucian who's got his dash up. You have to hit like all these like hypermobile champions, right? Like something like a Lilia or something like that. So I think this is something we want to be thinking about as we go forward in this video and just your analysis in general. And a couple points I had to branch off from this. You see here we have losing games matter the most. He mentions at certain times getting two full ults off in kind of like a extended, protracted fight. And in the example he shows in his video, he's actually crushing this game already. It's kind of what I'm talking about. Like, and whether or not the team comp was like perfect for him or not, the fact was that his team was dominating this game. So, you know, every game doesn't matter about team comp, you know, or team comp isn't always relevant in every game. Like some games you will have the worst team comp. People would make a mistake on the enemy team. You will just kind of run through them and you'll get in this scenario where you're stomping them, right? So the team comp doesn't always matter. But my point is when you're ahead, it's really easy to be like, oh, look, I got 2 ults in a fight. And look, I got this extra kill because of it. But it's like, well, yeah, but you would have survived getting that kill anyway, or not getting that kill anyway. Or maybe you would have done more damage with your basic abilities in another instance, or your ult the first time where you would have got the kill sooner, or you would have got a different kill in a different scenario, right? So you can do all these kind of what ifs and hypotheticals in multiple directions a lot of times. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. But yeah, my question would be, in these games where you're really struggling, where you're really pressured, right? Are you really able to get 2 full ults and get 2 full useful ults? Because that's the critical part, right? I can imagine you get your ult cooldown back up again, but are you actually using it in an effective way? Okay, because remember, let's say that you have your ability haste build and your ult cooldown is reduced 15 or 20 seconds, and you're in one of these really tough games, these losing games. So you use your ult, you get pretty good value out of it, and then it comes back up like 15, 20 seconds earlier for you, right, than it would have if you did the AP build. Unless you use that ult in the 15 to 20 seconds, that value is gone, essentially, right? And you're never getting it back, and you would have been way better off having damage for everything else that you casted in between, or for the next time you're going to use your ult, essentially. The first time you used it even, in that you may have done more in that fight where you got good value out of it. Okay, so it's very important. And also, I think in these games where you're losing, it's even harder to make good use of your abilities, right? So in other words, you're probably throwing your abilities out less in these games because you tend to be on the back foot, right? And the window you have from first cast to second cast is a lot shorter. You almost have to hit your first cast. An argument that people might be tempted to make was, well, when you're behind, you actually want more ability uses because, you know, if you miss your first ability, you at least have a chance to hit the second ability, but it's kind of the opposite way because if you're behind and you miss your first ability, what happens is that, you know, most of the time, the fight is just going to move past you, right? If you don't get your damage down effectively very early on in the fight in a game where you're behind, the enemy team is going to destroy your team, run through you, and you're just going to lose the game. So you're not going to get to your second rotation in these difficult games. The second thing that I would ask is, are you struggling to have your ult up in the losing games? Probably not, right? Why? Well, because you're going to use your ult more sparingly because the windows you have to actually use your ult, it's not even that you're trying to use it more sparingly necessarily, but the windows that you actually have to use it just come up less in a game where you're really behind. You're on the defensive, right? You have less vision. It's harder to make plays in general. So you typically have your playmaking abilities available in those games to actually make plays. So again, like something to keep in mind going forward, right? Now, the second thing that he talks about in his video, this is in the follow-up video he did where he responded to Ben, is this argument of the one-to-one thing. So what he means by this is, in the first video, the groundwork and that he kind of laid out, and I would say the overall premise of his video is that with ability haste, you get obviously more cast of your spells. So even though the direct damage isn't as good, you actually end up doing more damage overall or more damage over time. And like one of the really simple examples he uses that if you have 100 ability haste, you're getting like 50%. You're getting like double the casts off if you have 100 ability haste, right? So you would get 2 Qs off as opposed to getting 1 off. And when he does the calculations, the mathematics, he does this exactly like that. Like he'll take the damage on your abilities and he'll double them in the case where you have the 100 ability haste compared to the 0. Or, if you only had, let's say you had 50 ability haste, right? He would just do the math out as if you got to use your abilities exactly on cooldown. And I understand why he does this, right? Because there's not really a good way you can model a lot of the nuances of holding your abilities and still make your point, if that makes sense, right? And what he's doing here is not necessarily wrong, right? Because at a base level, when you're trying to explain things to people, it's very good to start with the absolute basics. So he's just trying to explain how ability haste works and how theoretically it can do more damage than the normal setup with like more pen. If you're casting the abilities, you're chain casting them back to back, not pen, but just ability power. So yeah, he's trying to explain how you'll do more damage by just chain casting the abilities back to back. That's fine, great for a baseline illustration. But there wasn't really a lot in that video where he goes into the nuances and kind of walking back that initial statement. Because I think how you should do it is you should introduce it how he did, but then you have to add in all the caveats, right? And he does mention them a little bit, but I think there's a lot of hand waving going on where it's like, well, yeah, you're not going to get full efficiency, but you're going to get efficiency in a lot of cases, and it's still overall going to be better. And I think this hand waving is where the video just really falls apart for me, because for me it's like completely the opposite, right? I think that this is where the in-game analysis even begins to fall apart, because from playing Vel'koz, if you've ever played Vel'koz a lot, that it's just very difficult to use your abilities back to back, chaining them while using them effectively, unless you're in those very easy games I talked about earlier on, where you're basically like hitting the front line, you're hitting tanks, you have a very easy target like a Cho'Gath to dump all your abilities into and melt, or something like that. In those cases, sure, you're getting really good uptime on your ability haste. But in cases where you have to actually do mind games, you have to do predictions, you have to try and get really creative with your Q or something like that, you're not firing them off back to back to back, and you're losing a ton of value. In fact, I think that's a big struggle that a lot of players have in tons of different types of games, is that they use their abilities way too frequently, right? In Overwatch, this is a problem with people who are, in the lower tiers that you don't see in the Apex tiers. They're like, it's the same thing in League. They'll just throw their abilities out willy-nilly, right? So this is something that he kind of hand waves in the video, and I think you just can't really afford to hand wave it, because you need to get into the details here. And in most cases, I would argue the real problem here is that you're not, in most cases, entering a binary where you either build ability haste or you don't, right? A lot of builds on Vel'koz do have ability haste built into them. Why is this? Well, the ability haste shard is a great shard because it's more cost effective than the ability power shard, right? So that's one thing. A lot of people play Comet, or they play Sorcery, and the middle thing in the tree, I think it's Transcendence. This is great value because you get access to it relatively early. By level 9, you have the full 10 ability haste, and it's not conditional at all based on your level after that. So you get the max value at level 9. You don't have to get to level 18 to get the full effect of the AP while you're above 70% one. So a lot of people take that. A lot of people will take the ability haste, I think it's Legend Haste or something like that, in the, the precision tree, right? And there's not really another great option there. If you don't need the mana regen one, you usually take Cut Down and Legend Ability Haste. So you get a lot of that ability haste no matter what build you're going, okay? Then a lot of people, especially if they're playing mid or bot Vel'koz, will have Horizon Focus somewhere in their build, so they're getting that ability haste. So a lot of Vel'koz builds just naturally get probably at least 50 to 60 ability haste, especially if they're mid lane. If they're support, it's a little bit different, and we can talk about support down below in a bit more detail. But you're normally getting that 50 to 60 ability haste value, and going to 100 or even going to 80 or 90, whatever value you get, the difference isn't that huge. So to give you an example, it would be one thing if Vel'koz Q, let's say it's like a 7-second cooldown, right? And, you invest fully into ability haste, 100 ability haste, and now it's down to a 3.5 second cooldown, right? That's a huge difference. But the reality is that for most builds, you're already going to be sitting at, probably a like a 4 second cooldown or a 4.2 second cooldown or something like that. And then if you invest the extra into ability haste by specifically building the other ability haste items, then you're going to get down to that 3.5 threshold or whatever it is. And so what we're realistically talking about on some of these basic abilities, especially the Q, which is the bread and butter of Vel'koz, you're going to be using it a lot. Sometimes in the Q, you're talking about a 0.5 second difference or a 0.75 second difference. And if you're not using that Q right off cooldown, that's getting wasted in almost every rotation. Like, it's very rare that I will spam my Q that much where I would notice a 0.75 second cooldown reduction in it. Almost never going to be the case. Not against a hard team, not against a team where I actually have to think about how I'm playing and what I'm doing. So in those scenarios, that extra ability haste that you were getting on top goes completely wasted, basically, right? You're literally not getting any value of it at all. And even on your abilities where it does get you a bit more value because they have longer base cooldowns like your E, you have to think to yourself, how often are you getting multiple E's a fight? And then would the E have not been up the second time? Would it be that big of a difference? Like, did you have to use it exactly in that 1.5, 2 second window where you wouldn't have had it had you built the AP build? In most cases, the answer is going to be no. How many times have I fought doing an AP-orientated build or a defensive-orientated build where I didn't have my ult up? Not very often on Vel'koz. Vel'koz ult doesn't really have that long of a cooldown, right? So it's not very uncommon for me to have ult for almost all the fights where I need it, is just the reality. So if it was a situation where you were building no haste versus building 100 haste, you could see the value difference, and it would be pretty stark in some cases. But since you're already going to be building an innate amount of ability haste in most cases on the champion just kind of naturally through your build path, like Horizon Focus is just a great item on Vel'koz, even barring the ability haste. The 10% damage synergizer is great with this true damage, with things like it buffs Comet, it buffs Cut Down, buffs Scorch, buffs all these things, right? So that's just a great item in general. A lot of the other ability haste pickups are just natural, so you're going to have a decent amount, and it's less about going from 0 to 100, and more like in most cases you're going from maybe 60 to 80, or 60 to 90, or 60 to 100, maybe in the worst case scenario. So just something to kind of think about there. Now, another thing he mentions is ability haste securing more passive procs. So this is something that, it obviously can happen, but I'm very skeptical about this happening consistently. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? First, in a protracted fight, you often don't get to target the same targets, especially as a ranged kind of AP artillery mage, because what tends to happen is as you damage people, they rotate out to the back, especially if it's a squishy target that you care about. So maybe you're fighting around Dragon, and you hit kind of a cheeky Q on Caitlyn, right? And you chunk her to 70% or something. She knows that. She knows you're there. She's now adjusting her positioning to play more behind her tanks. So it's very unlikely that you're able to get follow-up damage on that, even if you have another faster Q, right? You have to hit another insane Q probably to even touch her again. It's going to be probably a super long range one. And then you have to hit a third one to touch her again. And you're not really going to be able to extend the duration of the passive with your auto because, she's likely playing in the back of her team. This does happen more on the front line. But again, typically what it's happening to in the front line are those tankier champions that are going to be easy to hit regardless, no matter what you're building, right? So yeah, you maybe get a little bit more value out of your passive against them, but against any of the difficult champions to hit, something like a Zed, something like a LeBlanc, where they're kind of blinking in and out of the fight, or they have a very high movement speed, like something like a Hecarim or something like that, those champions, they're in the front line now, potentially, or, they're at least going to be in the front line for some portion of time, but they're very hard to hit with multiple abilities anyway. So this idea that, you're going to be able to make use of the passive you had on them. Maybe you hit one ability, you didn't hit the second one. And all of a sudden, because you got your second rotation a little bit sooner, the fact that we're thinking this is going to translate into additional damage most of the time, I think that this is naive, and I think that I think even Azzapp knows that this is kind of stretching the we're I don't want to say we're stretching the truth in the sense that I'm not trying to say that he's trying to lie, but we're being maybe a bit too generous to how useful ability haste is being here, right? So that's something I want to talk about with the ability haste securing more passives. Again, not impossible, but when you really think about the situations pragmatically where this is going to be happening in the game, it's not going to be on the higher side of things, right? And keep in mind, you're always paying a cost for this, right? So even in the scenarios where you are able to extend your passive and you're able to get a proc that you wouldn't have otherwise, you're actually doing more damage with your abilities in the first scenario, right? So yeah, you got the additional passive proc in the second scenario, but you did more damage to everybody before that in the first scenario. So again, it's something you have to weigh back and forth, right? And this point right here, this is kind of going back to what I was saying about the ability haste value being kind of binary in some circumstances, where if you didn't, if you throw a Q and then, you hit that window where your ability would have been back up if you're the ability haste build, and it's 2 seconds or maybe I was going to say a second before it comes back up as the AP build. If you don't actually throw and hit an ability in that 1 second, that value just got completely erased. It is completely binary in that circumstance, If your ult comes up way sooner because of your ability haste build, 10, 15 seconds sooner, and you don't use it in that 10 or 15 seconds, in that particular instance, you lost all value right now. Again, the next time you use it, you might get value out of it. So I'm not saying you lose value for the entire game, but in those scenarios, in those cooldown windows, if you don't actually make use of the ability, it completely goes away. Okay. Coming down to here, arguments wishing you had more rotations could easily just be made in the converse, wishing you had more damage. This is kind of what I was saying just a moment ago, where, anytime you say the reason I was able to slay him there is because I had an additional ability rotation, or I got an additional passive proc because of an additional ability rotation or something like that, you could always just make the argument that, hey, maybe he actually would have died the first time if I had more damage there. Or, maybe I would have gotten him low enough for somebody else to finish him. This is actually a big thing on Vel'koz, in my opinion, and a lot of what Azzapp's video kind of seemed to leave out, in my opinion, was the poke aspect of his champion. And I understand why I think he feels this way, or maybe didn't feel the need to include this in the video, because honestly, playing poke in solo queue is hard and very annoying because none of your team really wants to play around you. And we're in diamond games right now, my duo and I, things haven't really gotten much better. And I don't assume that they get really that better in Apex tier either, because how this game kind of works is everybody is in their own little mind, in their own little island, playing the game how they see. And if you're something like a Diana, it doesn't matter, if your team is completely controlling the fight. If I'm on Diana's team and I'm just destroying them from long range, and I'm just pelting them, she actually doesn't care at the end of the day. If she sees most of them don't care, at least. Maybe a Gurren would care, right? Somebody that's a great solo queue, a Gurren's a great player. He has a mind for the game, right? He would care maybe. But most Diana players, most engaged players, they're not going to care that you're pelting them with Qs. If they see a good opportunity to engage, or what they think is a good opportunity, they're just going to take it regardless. Whether the enemy team can counter engage, whether they can't counter engage, they're just going to go in, blow their load, and hope for the best. That's how most people play engaged style champions. So it can be very difficult to kind of get your poke off in these situations. But that doesn't mean you never get it off, or in some cases, and to me what it means is you actually have to build around your poke more in a certain sense, which means investing into ability power, right? So because you're not going to get as many chances to kind of just stay around the Dragon Pit, stay around the Baron Pit, and pelt these people, you need to make sure that when you do hit them, and some of them it's hard to hit because they have a lot of mobility, right? We were saying before, right? Yeah, it sticks. You have to make sure you do a lot of bursts to them. And when you do hit them like that, if I hit a Caitlyn around Dragon, there's a big difference between me doing 40% of her life with a Q, where I have my Storm Surge that hit her, and I have Pen for my Pen boots and the Pen on the Storm Surge. And in some cases, you can do this cool tech where you have Storm Surge and Leandries, where the Storm Surge proc actually reprocs the Liandry's, so this is very deadly on a squishy. If you have Storm Surge Liandry's, which has no haste, right, and you throw a Q and you hit something like a Caitlyn, you getting the pen on her, which the pen is even more effective than normal, right, because she has a low MR, and she's most likely not itemizing into MR, and so she's taking more damage from getting the pen, right? You have high ability haste from the Storm Surge to begin with. The Liandry's doesn't have as high ability haste, but we'll get into Liandry's at the end of the video. But you're getting the burn on her. Then the Storm Surge procs deals even more burst damage, and it resets the burn. You could take a Caitlyn, if you're in a pretty decent spot, even on support with that build, to like 60% from 1Q. And that's huge because that makes her play differently, right? She can't play the same when she's 60% life. Or if she does try and play the same, she's probably fodder for your front line, right? She's going to get blown up way easier. Other people can clean her up way faster than they would be able to if she was at 80% from that Q. And like I said, it can be hard to hit these long-range Qs on backline targets, but when you do, you want them to be super valuable, right? Even if that target stays in the backline, like I said, it's affecting how she's contributing to the fight because she's not contributing much. And if you have super dive, they could even bypass the enemy team entirely and dive on her because maybe they couldn't actually kill her from 100 to 0 diving on her with maybe her team being able to peel a little bit. But maybe this Kayn thinks, hey, 60%? I can make that happen. This Talon? Oh, I can kill her from 60%. Yeah, they can peel a little bit. They can heal, they can shield, but I can still eat her when she's at 60% life. And I couldn't eat her when she was at 100, right? So I think making the most out of these kind of fewer opportunities that you have is another thing where the raw damage from AP really shines through and is better in a lot of cases than ability haste. So I think I mentioned this here. The ladder comes up more commonly due to your ability to poke and reduce the kill threshold of other champions. So what I mean by that is like you're reducing the threshold for your team to be able to kill them, right? And then also in most games, the timing window where you actually get another full rotation is uncommon. I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the start with burst damage, especially when you're behind in the tougher games, right? Where a lot of times that second rotation, it's not going to come. You need to do your damage and you need to do it well in the first rotation, right? Otherwise, you're not going to be around to have a second one, or your team's not going to be around to benefit from you getting a second rotation. So the weakness window thing, I wanted to talk about this, right? So what he's saying is true about the weakness window, right? That the more haste you have, the weakness window is shorter. Again, I would go back to what we talked about, though, a little bit earlier, where we talk about the fact that this is not a situation where you're not building any haste, right? So if you have 50 to 60 ability haste, almost like naturally on a build, and you're comparing that to like 80 to 90 ability haste, the weakness window really isn't that much different, right? And it's unlikely that you're going to get like a really critical ability in that very small weakness window with the ability haste build that you wouldn't have been able to get with the normal build. So that's what I mean by it's often not noticeable. And a lot of times what's going to happen with this weakness window is enemies tend to punish you very quickly after you use the ability. So if I miss my E on Vel'koz, right, typically that's going to prompt an almost immediate response from the enemy in terms of either if they can go on me and try and actually kill me, or if they can just take up more space in the lane, right? It's not really going to be a thing where, and then what's going to happen is, so they'll push me immediately and get the initial advantage for my weakness window being active, but then they're not really going to have the foresight to think in their mind like, okay, where is this guy's E coming back up? In fact, a lot of other champions in the game, I think, tend to falsely assume that your cooldowns are lower on the champions that we play, because they don't play these champions and they just assume they're used to having shorter cooldowns, and they just assume that we have shorter cooldowns as well, right? So it's like in most cases, an enemy player is going to give you the benefit of the doubt that your abilities have been up if you haven't used it in a little bit. So taking advantage of this very narrow window, like the enemy is not thinking about it that deeply, right? They're just not going to engage you. Like if they even think there's a chance that your E is back up, they're not going in, right? Unless they have a very good understanding of the game. If we operate in a system where everybody had a fantastic understanding of the game, and Vel'koz specifically, and his cooldowns and everything like that, then I think this point would be more pertinent, right? Because, people would be timing your abilities out in their head almost down to like the second, but that's just not what happens. There's too many champions in the game. Vel'koz is such an obscure champion. This is not really a problem you run into in a lot of cases, right? Where, people are they're just going to assume that your E is up if you haven't just used it recently, right? And that's kind of like the same with a lot of your other abilities. There's not going to be a lot of fights where they assume Vel'koz ult is down unless you've just used it. And if you've just used it or you've just used your E, even getting more haste, it's not going to reduce the weakness window enough to save you there, right? You're still always going to have a weakness window no matter what, and you're just shortening it by a very small value when you add a bit of extra haste on top. So the basic synergy comment he made, talking about how, you have more, your abilities get closer together, basically, when you have more haste, right? Because things like your W and your E are longer cooldowns comparatively to your Q, so your ability haste is affecting your Q less. Well, it's not like affecting it less, quote unquote, but you know what I mean? It's like, since the cooldown is already low, it's not gaining as much cooldown reduction as the other abilities are. So what getting haste does is it tightens the spread, so you're able to use your abilities together more. My argument to this is you're pretty much never, my rebuttal to this is you're pretty much never using your abilities solo anyway, right? And a lot of times the ability that you're using to set up your other abilities is your Q, and that is the one with the shortest cooldown period, right? And that's the one that's least affected by ability haste in the sense that you're going to gain the least amount of value because it already is the lowest cooldown, right? So, having a build that skews more towards ability haste, and you have a 0.5 to 0.8 second, maybe at max, difference in your Q cast time, right? Being able to recast another Q, that's most likely not going to make a difference. You can wait the 0.5 seconds, the 0.8 seconds to try and reset yourself up again in most cases, right? And that's what's gonna lead into all the other abilities. You're not like he does this kind of weird thing in the video where he is talking about if you throw your Q out and you miss, and then you throw your W and you throw your E, and now the abilities aren't synced and they have longer cooldowns and stuff like that. And it's like, well, yeah, but you never you almost never throw a blind W at anybody on Vel'koz unless that's gonna kill them, or you need to proc your passive, or you're proccing Leandri's on them to kill them or something, you know what I mean? There are situations where you will do it, but it's not a common thing whatsoever. And most of the time you don't naked E unless you're doing it from, maybe you're on vision or something, or you're not on vision, you're hidden, right? And you're trying to ambush them or something like that. You could throw it there. Or, when you're retreating, sometimes you can get a little cheeky with your E. They're not expecting you to throw naked E. So there's some things you can do like that, kind of little mind gamey things, but you're typically not trying to throw a naked E. A lot of the times on Vel'koz, you're not trying to throw a naked W, right? And a lot of your abilities are going to be thrown based off hitting your Q. And when you're not doing that, when you're not setting up combos, your Q is going to be kind of almost like your boxing jab that you're just going to be throwing all the time. And then when your jab lands, sometimes you're able to follow up with an actual combo, and other times you're not, depending on your positioning. But I really didn't like this idea of your abilities become so disjointed if you don't have enough haste. It's again, you're going to have haste on the champion at a baseline. So it's not like you have no haste at all. The difference is going to be very minor. And I mean, if you're using your abilities out of order and out of sync, that's kind of just bad generalized play. It doesn't really have much to do with what you're building. And the final thing I wanted to talk about here, and he did mention some of these items, so I obviously give him credit in this video. He didn't neglect these items, but I want to mention kind of some of the dangers of glazing ability haste too much, because many of the best AP items in the game have 0 ability haste on them. And I'll kind of go through these. I'm going to make my own separate video on Banshee's Veil, because I think this item is actually god tier, especially on Vel'koz in a lot of scenarios, but I'll just kind of give you the quick rundown here. Basically, Banshees is an incredible item. The shield is amazing because you kind of want to get close on Vel'koz. In fact, being able to get somewhat close, you don't want to be super close, you don't want to be in melee, but being able to threaten getting close is huge because it allows you to set up your Q easier, because you get basically 2 ways to hit your Q. And especially if there's multiple targets, right? Because you can throw it directly at them, and then you can fork it at somebody else, or potentially even fork it at them, depending on the angle you're throwing the Q at. So there's a lot of value in being able to kind of run at people on Vel'koz, and typically that's something that's very hard to do. Banshee's Veil gives you a buffer in being able to do this, especially dealing with long-range CC abilities. Banshee's Veil can be great against somebody like Leona. This is like a god-tier item against a Leona, especially if there's not somebody on the enemy team who can really get your BV off easily. You can position so aggressively versus this champion, because even if you don't have flash, she can't just drop her R on you. You know, she's just screwed. Things like Nautilus Hook, right? You can position so much more aggressively, being able to use a BV. You don't even need the full BV. You can just use the Verdant Barrier portion, right? You can build a Verdant Barrier and then build something else entirely, right, if you wanted. So BV, an absolutely insane item, an item that I build in a lot of my games. I think has a ton of value, especially because you use it quite well on Vel'koz, in the sense that a lot of the things that on other champions would take your BV out easily, that doesn't really happen on Vel'koz, right? Because a lot of times if you're building it against dive, you're sitting in the back, it's hard for them to actually break it before they get on you with the dive. So it's most likely absorbing something that's relevant. And then again, like if they're using something like a ranged Leona ult that's CC, like a ranged CC, again, that blocks it completely, right? It's difficult for them to break it before they actually try and land the CC on you, because you're playing from range anyway, right? So it's a fantastic item. This item has no ability haste on it, right? Zhonya's. This item, I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. This is a god tier item in certain circumstances. I do think Zhonya's is a little bit underrated, unfortunately, on champions like Vel'koz. Ironically, I think that, I don't know what the design intent of this item was. It almost seems like it was designed for squishier targets, but ironically, I think this item is better on champions like Diana and stuff like that are going to naturally go in anyway, because you can always get value out of it all the time by going in, letting your shield get depleted, then immediately Zhonya's, right? Whereas on Vel'koz, sometimes if you get caught out of position, even if you Zhonya's, you're going to get cleaned up anyway, right? So it is a more situational item on Vel'koz, and you really do need your team to be kind of cognizant and at least playing the game. And like, this is not going to help you a ton in 1v9 scenarios where your team is just really bad, because in a lot of times where you are going to be using your Zhonya's, you're going to be using it to bait, or you're going to be using it to absorb heavy dive, and your team needs to be able to make plays off of that to be able to keep you alive and allow you to get more rotations off after it. So it's not a panacea item in every game or anything, but it's a very strong item, and this item also has no ability haste, right? Finally, the Andres. I like to build this for a ton of reasons. It has great synergy with some items like Storm Surge, like I mentioned, because anything that like does a damage proc, it can re-proc the Liandry's if the damage proc is delayed, which it is on Storm Surge. So great value there. The HP is great on a champion like Vel'koz, right? Because it's not like Xerath where you're like way in the back. Sometimes you need to get a little bit close. So the HP is actually useful, and the burn is fantastic for a couple of reasons. The first is that the Liandry's is just a great item, in my opinion, ever since the, what was that called? The durability patch. Because what the durability patch did is it increased the base health of a lot of champions, and people are just way tankier now. A lot of people take the HP runes. A lot of bruisers just have, health in their kit. A lot of mid lanes, like AP mid lanes, have health in their kit. Even something like Dusk and Dawn, which you think of as a damage item, has health on it, right? So many items just randomly have health on it. Support item has health on it. Traditional supports are going to have health, like tank supports, right? They're obviously building health. Enchanters actually inadvertently build a decent amount of health even through their items. There's a lot of health on their items, and they're getting health from support item and from runes and stuff like that. So really the only characters that aren't building like extra health are like kind of AD carries and maybe some mid laners. A lot of the popular mid laners right now, like Brand, he builds a lot of health, right? So Aurelion Soul builds health. even like there's still like versions of like Talon and Zed build health, and those champions have not awful HP scaling to begin with, right? So Liandry is just actually a great item, even outside of like a super tank setting. It actually does respectable damage against even kind of, it does respectable damage now, even against AD carries like Caitlyn, to be honest, which is insane, because that should be like the worst use case for this item ever, is a champion like Caitlyn. Like, you should never wanting to have it against a champion like that, but, and I'm not saying that you necessarily want it if you were playing against a team of 5 Caitlyns, but it still actually does okay damage, and the fact that it does okay damage to a champion like that is insane. Because against any champion with a little bit of extra HP, it's really great against. And then, like, the super tanks, it's obviously invaluable against things like Cho'Gath, anybody that's building Heartsteel, Tahm Kench. Like, you farm these champions with Liandry's damage. So having Liandry's in your build is very important a lot of the times. Yeah, so I mean, I think these 3 items are super important. You're going to want to build them in a large percentage of your games, at least one of them, sometimes multiple of them. And none of these items have haste. So now I'm not saying that Azzapp did call out Banshee and Zhonya's as being great items, right? So not trying to say he's saying not to build these items. But what I'm saying is if you get into people's mind that ability haste is this uber great stat, they are going to undervalue these items just by proxy, and like just even though he did mention them in his video, if you spend like the first 10, 12 minutes glazing ability haste to the nth degree, and then you spend, like 1 to 2 minutes talking about these like niche MVP items, people are still going to just forget about the niche MVP items, and they're going to focus on getting more and more ability haste. So just something I want to point out there that definitely, even if you don't like my arguments here and you think that they're bad about ability haste, like even if you're like the biggest ability haste enjoyer, you're like the biggest ability haste glazer out there, don't underestimate these items that don't have any ability haste, because they're all insane in their own right, and a lot of them have a place being built in most games that you're going to be playing, at least like one of them or multiple of them. So that's my TED Talk on ability haste. Again, we focus very much on the kind of like intuition side or the pragmatic side, the actual gameplay side of things. And even on the gameplay side, I think ability haste is soundly defeated by just either getting more damage or getting these special items. And that's kind of like the last point I actually want to make before I turn this video off, is that I think the conversation should be less about ability power versus ability haste and more about when do we build more offensive versus when do we build more defensive. Because I think when you're building more offensively, you should almost always be going for just raw damage and ability power. But the real question becomes, when should we build items like Banshee's Veil? When should we build items like Zhonya's? When should we build items like Liandry's? Right, and figuring out the balance of when we should build those items, when we need to build the defensive items, when the defensive items actually give us more damage, as Azzapp does rightfully point out in one of his videos. He mentions how, an item like Zhonya's can give you more damage than Shadow Flame, because it's giving you more access to damage, which is a great way to put it. I actually love that from him. Worded very well, right? And figuring that conversation out and figuring that out in your individual games, that's what's going to net you more wins than thinking about it just from the perspective of, do I want to build more haste or do I want to build more ability power? Because at the end of the day, they're both offensive stats, right? And I think that I'm in the ability power camp for the most part, both math-wise and, pragmatically in-game experience-wise. But again, I think it's more about when do we weave in these defensive items to allow us to actually do even more damage, to get better access like he's talking about. So fantastic point he kind of ended his video on, and I definitely wanted to highlight that here because I fully believe the same thing. I'm going to be talking about that a lot in my video that I make about Banshee's Veil. So that's the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, like no hate to Azzapp or anything. Like he's a super chill guy. Definitely go check out his stream. He's awesome. Just you can learn a lot from him. And at the end of the day, like it's not like I think he's putting horrible information out there into the community. But I just wanted to kind of share a different perspective of my thoughts of playing the game so far. And I realized that, I'm not Challenger and, I don't have as much experience in the game as he does. But, I have come from a background of Apex, like I've been in the Apex tiers in other games, right? And I have that analytical background from MMOs that I'm trying to bring over here. So I think that there's some validity to what I'm saying in this video at least, and it's not complete like horse stuff from just a lower rank player. And I'm trying to push into that Apex tier. We're in Diamond right now, right? And this is our first climb, so maybe we'll even get there. But we'll have to see. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like content like this, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to be posting more videos of the climb. Just wanted to kind of get this out here, and the Banshees video is coming soon. And I'm going to make a video on Storm Surge, and then we're going to make a video on the runes and stuff like that. So keep posted if you like Vel'koz content, Artillery Mage content, and I'll talk to you guys next time. And also, go check out Ben T Beyond Repair, because that guy's videos are awesome. The first one and the second one makes great content. So him and Azzapp, keep them in your mind. See you guys. Have a good one.